Hey guys, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perelshteyn, and today we're going to talk about how to tackle the very solid Slav defense that GothamChess recommended in his famous YouTube videos in the opening after d4, d5, c4, c6. The whole point of the Slav is, unlike its cousin, the Queen's Gambit decline. In the Queen's Gambit decline, this bishop on c8 gets blocked by the pawn. This is the fundamental difference. And because of that, white typically enjoys long-lasting small advantage. Now, the point of the Slav is the bishop is going to get out. f5 or g4. Once black gets the bishop out and plays e6, generally speaking, black will not experience any opening issues because he's going to have no bad pieces. So I'm going to recommend to you my pet line, which is the exchange Slav. At first, it seems like it's a concession because you trade your c4 pawn for the c6 pawn. But in reality, we're going to use the extra tempo that we get by playing this move knight c3. And already, believe it or not, black has to be careful because the natural move, the mirror image move, knight c6, is not as good as knight f6 because of this very cool idea e4. Not a lot of people know about this. So a lot of your opponents may fall for this trap. e6 is already a concession. Now after e5, black gets a really bad version of the French defense. Typically in the French, the pawn is on c5, white's pawn is on c3, and this knight gets stuck. Can't get there. Now the knight is comfortably on c3. There's no tension. The pawn on c5 is not hitting the pawn. White is clearly better with knight f3, bishop d3, castles, and eventually when black castles attacking the weak point, the g7 pawn. So the natural reaction, of course, is to take the pawn. And here comes my idea. Don't take it back on e4 because the d4 hangs. d5 is the key move. And this, I believe, is a real problem for black. Black does not have any adequate knight moves. Knight a5 and knight b4 will drop a piece. So for example, b4 traps the knight out, right? Knight b4 we have this beautiful double attack, check, and picking up the knight. Knight b8 is admitting your mistake, right? You're just going back. So knight e5 is what I typically face when I get this position on the board. Now, very important sequence. We want to win this pawn, but not with the knight. We're going to use the queen to do that. Check, here, takes, hitting the knight one more time. Notice the poor knight has nowhere else to go except g6. And now another very important move. It's tempting to start with knight f3, but it's less accurate. It's less accurate because we want to anticipate knight f6, queen e2. We need to get that bishop out first. So bishop c4, knight f6, queen e2, and now the opening is almost over, and the difficult part for black is this bishop is entombed inside his own pawns. This pawn can never move because of the knight. This pawn can never move because we have 1, 2, 3 guys eyeing that square. And black is facing serious difficulties. I won so many games with this position. White just plays natural moves, knight f3, castles, gets this bishop out, connects the rooks, and attacks the king directly. So let's go back. And this shows you how dangerous this line is for black right off the bat when they answer with knight c6. The more logical move is, of course, knight to f6. So far, we are in the main line of the exchange Slav, and here white has tried bishop f4, knight f3, but my favorite move is immediately to put pressure on this knight with bishop to g5. Now, it is very uncomfortable for black to allow the double pawns with bishop takes f6. So a lot of players play this move e6. But if you think about it, the whole point of the Slav defense, like I mentioned earlier, was to get this bishop outside the pawn chain. Now the bishop gets locked, and white is clearly better. For example, e3, bishop e7, bishop d3, knight c6, knight f3, castles, castles. This bishop gets stuck and would have to develop to passive square. For example, bishop to d7. Here, white has lots and lots of cool ideas. you can start with rook c1 to meet knight b4, bishop b1, for instance. And here you could think about slow plan with queen e2, or the more aggressive plan with knight e5 and f4. Both of these plans do give white a sizable advantage. And if they play, let's say, neutral move a6, this is the dream structure. The bishop's outside the pawns. Both pawns protect the knight. We've got a clear target, the enemy king, and the rook can swing over to h3, or the queen can use the f3 square as well. In both cases, white is clearly better. So this is another important plan. So after bishop g5, e6 is exactly the type of position we're aiming to reach. And if they play knight c6, with the idea, again, to keep this bishop, give him an option to get out, we take. And now no matter how black takes, white is comfortably better. If they take this way, we play e3, g3, for example, bishop d6, bishop g2, start eyeing this pawn. And then this knight is going to join the party. For example, a6, the knight can go to f4. So this is a liability, and the queen can go to b3. This d5 is really weak. And the more popular move, though, is to take with the g pawn, right, to keep his center nice and fluid. But that will eventually open up the enemy king. He's got lots of weaknesses. We can play e3. Typically, they play e6, get the bishop out, knight f3, both sides castle. White's a little bit better and have very nice attacking chances. Again, this bishop is stuck. So this is sort of the most logical moves for black, and still, because of the double pawns, they're worse. So there is a move that only a few players know when they study theory how to handle this move. It's this move knight e4, which is by far the best main line. But now we get into very unusual pawn structure. We trade, they usually take. You see how we create these double pawns? Now it is essential for us not to blunder horribly. The correct move here is a3, keeping control over the b4 square. And with queen check, it's very important that d2 square is controlled by the queen or the bishop. If you lose that control, you play e3, oops, you would lose the game in one move. Check, drops the bishop. So it's very important to play this move a3. And the point of a3, if knight d5, if knight c6, then d5 push. You already know the drill. Check, takes, picking up a pawn. So knight c6 is no go. e6 obviously drops the queen. f6 will ruin, let's go back. f6 will ruin the structure of the king, and this position is not easy to play. So what does black typically play here? Black typically plays queen d5, hitting the bishop, queen d2. This is one possible way. If h6, we go back to either f4 or h4. If knight c6, we can play e3. Rook can go to c1. The bishop can go to c4. Knight can go to e2, c3, castles. And again, the double pawns, even though this time black can't get the bishop to f5 or g4, the double pawns are quite weak. White is doing well in these structures. So that is the setup that I would recommend against the Slav. Again, the key is, it's called the exchange Slav, to play knight c3, knight c6, e4 is the key move. And after knight f6, bishop g5 starts the sequence where I believe knight e4 is probably the best try for equality, but black would have to know how to play with those double pawns, which is not that easy. Any questions about this?
Yeah, I was wondering a little bit earlier, what if black goes this radical looking e5 move here?
Yeah, it's a gambit. It's actually a good question. How do we handle this gambit line? Well, there are several ways. Of course, you can just protect the pawn on d4, but then you're not really fighting for the advantage. I think you really have to take the pawn. And then attacking the knight can retreat to b1. So black still has to waste time winning that pawn. For example, this is direct way to win the pawn, right? Now the queen gets tossed around, right? She would have to go somewhere here, and then we're going to keep attacking the queen with this fan-shadowed bishop. should have to retreat back at some point. And eventually white's going to play knight b3 and harass the pawn. I think by wasting too many queen moves, black is going to run into issues here. So yeah, the key is don't be afraid of this gambit line. Take the pawn, redirect the knight, and then little by little, once black takes the pawn on e5, activate all your pieces with nice initiative.
Hey, check this video out to make sure that you get more important information to bring your chess to the next level.